Hey folks, my name is David Schmidt. You can find me on various medias. I'm currently, for the last year, I've been the tech lead for developer experience at Puppet, and we worked on a couple of projects to make the life easier for modern developers. Just a quick show of hands. One of you has been working or is working on a Puppet module that contains native code. All right. Which one of you actually enjoyed the experience? Yeah, I envy your pain resistance. So one of the things we came up with is a new resource API. For all of you who have not been working on those native providers, let me give you a quick introduction on what providers are in the Puppet ecosystem. They are basically how Puppet knows how to manage small bits of your systems that you want to change. The type defines the shape of the resource, which attributes are there that can be manipulated, what's the name, and what are the possible values for that. The provider itself then allows you to read the state of those resources and finally enforce a desired state onto that system, and that's how Puppet interacts with all resources out there. Puppet Core has some well-known providers like file, package, user. Many modules have built-in resources, like the AWS module has built-in resources for EC2 instances, RDS, etc., etc. Then there are, like Marcus just showed, the KDB key, again a native provider, where a small piece of Ruby code interfaces between the Puppet manifest language and the actual real-world systems. So, quick overview, because I don't have much time here. This is how resources looked like in Puppet 3, and much for our embarrassment also in Puppet 4. Up here you define a new type as a snippet of Ruby that gets passed in more code than like down here, which defines a property called size with a description in it, and this here says it's usually a multiple of 1024, and this property is read-only. So there are quite a few problems with this approach that we found over the years. One, it's Ruby code, so if another consumer wants to gain an understanding of how that resource type looks like, you need to run that Ruby code, and to run that Ruby code, you need all of Puppet, which is a quite sizable code base, and which makes it very inconvenient to use those resources or even interrogate what resources are available and how they look like from outside of Puppet. The other thing is, since the properties down here are also defined as code, if you have specific validation needs, like, oh, this actually should only be a number, all of that is usually encoded in either regular expressions or custom code, which again is not directly available outside of Puppet itself. And finally, you'll notice that the description here says this property is read-only, which if you have resources that also can show you more state of the system than it's actually able to manage. The only thing that keeps users from trying to push values into that is this sentence there, and maybe a hand-coded check in the provider itself. But again, usually convenient to use or really safe to use. If you have special requirements, like a Boolean property, I was not able to fit that code onto a slide, so I'll spare you the pain of that. Because, as I said, Resource API is now gearing up to change that significantly and make all of this much easier. So here we have the shape of a new style resource. For now, since it's still pre-release, you need to require the public resource API on top here, and then pass in a data structure into a single function call. Again, to make it currently work with autoloading, and because we are still working on the details there, currently this is still Ruby code, but the core information of that is just a Ruby hash that can easily be loaded from JSON or something else if you want so, and that's what we're planning for the next step. But it's just a Ruby hash. It has the name, it has the doc string here, it has some features that your implementation has, and then down here it just has a list of attributes, for example the ensure attribute here with the usual definition of present apps, and as you can see here, now this fully supports Puppet for data types, so there is no ambiguity around what possible values go into your provider. Here on the right side, the size attribute from before. This is now an integer, and you can specify the read-only behavior here, and all of that works out of the box as expected. And you don't need any custom code in the provider to make that happen. Since talking about code is boring, I've brought a small demo here. All of this works with current code, at least with the nightly release of the PDK. So this is the only non-fully released piece of software I'll show you. The next version of the PDK will have that built in, at least as an experimental feature. As I said, we're using this already internally, but we want to get your feedback on how this works out for you and what you would like to see next in there and what doesn't work for you, so that we can make it better over the next few weeks and months. So we'll start out with a new module. As of yet, new provider demo. As of yet, the module also requires a couple of more prerequisites so that the unit test integration works. If you run PDK new provider and the provider name, it will point you to the documentation which is here. And you need this sync YAML here to install the additional dependency. One of our next things that we want to do is to integrate the resource API into the core Puppet agent once we're satisfied with that it actually works as we intend. So now the additional things have been installed here, and I can say PDK new provider demo, and it creates these view files we need for the provider. And let's start it up in an editor here. So this is the module I just created, and as you're used to, can you read that? Exactly what I showed you before. The ensure, by default, it just creates an ensure and a name property, but you can add additional properties here. You can add parameters which are information that's not persisted into the system and just information for your provider how to work. you can have doc strings in here. All of the details of that are explained in detail in the readme of the resource API. What's probably more interesting to you is then the provider itself. If you ever have touched one of those plugins, you know that there is quite a bit of data wrangling going on to get the data from the manifest into a structure that you can actually work with. The instances method, the prefetch method, the exists method, the flush method, the property hash, and if you touch more than a few of those, you will likely have found multiple permutations of the same patterns over and over again, and it's all very confusing. The resource API only requires you to implement two methods. One is the get method here. In the current boot provider, it's just a stupid example. It runs a command and processes the standard out. But what you need to do here is just return an array of hashes that have the shape of your resource. So in the type, we saw it has a ring and a true method, and here we just return hashes of that. And all of those hashes that get returned are then visible to Puppet as resources that are currently in the system. In the simplest cases, like here in this example, you can inherit from the simple provider, which gives you a couple of lines of code of base functionality, and then you get called down here, either with create, update, or delete, depending on what Puppet wants from you, and those methods get passed in a context for logging purposes, the name of the resource that should be acted on, and again a hash of the attributes that should be set in the system, and this allows you to very easily just have that little snippet of code that you need to either call an external API or run a local command to enforce the state that should be in there. And finally, what we also do, we render out a unit test for this provider that provides a high level of coverage for the generated code. One of the things, existing types of providers are so deeply tied into the Puppet code base, it's always very hard to write proper unit tests for them, because you have to guess how Puppet is reacting in all those different method calls that I listed before. For the resource API, you only have to test that if the get method is called with a context, it calls to, say, an external command, and if that external command returns a specific standard out, you can provide that in your you can provide that in your test. Like here, I have the command creates an echo command here that was used in the example, and then the test is the echo command should receive run and return a standard out with some resources. And for example, if the return of that command then is empty, get is expected to return empty. And if the command returns some output, the provider is expected to return those resources. We have still quite a bit of time left, so if you have specific questions, I'm more than happy to answer them. Yes, please. So the question was whether the PDK is meant just to ease writing providers, or whether this here is a completely new type of provider. And there are two things going on here. One is the resource API chain itself, and I have and in the slides I will upload them to the FOSDEM to Pentabar later. In the resource API chain is basically usable without the PDK, but the PDK just makes it easier because it creates those 3 files for you. The resource providers that you write with the resource API are usable with all Puppet versions that will commercially support. That is Puppet 4.7 and onwards, because there are some infrastructure things that the API requires for the Puppet 4 data type support. They are also usable with the open source versions of 4.7 and onwards. So they're fully integrated into the Puppet ecosystem there. I've only shown the PDK new provider thing because it makes it easier to get started, and it gives you those few things to get it started without having to type loads of code. Yes, please. Sorry? Yes, I can. I don't see a future where we will remove the old API within the next 3 to 5 years, right? Like there's still lots of content out there. It's still very useful to people. Also, there are a couple of things that we currently can't do in the resource API, like if you need for some reason access to the catalog, very deliberately to avoid entangling the resource API with Puppet itself. The resource API currently doesn't give you access to the catalog. Some advanced types currently do that. We're looking into ways to solve that at a different level, where you say you can post-process the entire catalog, but that's still on the roadmap. But yeah, back to our original question, though, there is no plan currently to deprecate the existing types of providers APIs. Existing providers will work as going forward as before. I would gladly help any who want to port their code to the new API and get rid of approximately a third of the lines of code. I would be happy to help. I'm always on the Puppet user email list, or if you on Slack if you ping me as develops. Also, I forgot to mention, linked from the Puppet Resource API is also example code of for more fully-fledged providers. Like I ported one of the things I did, I ported over the app key in app key management provider in an afternoon. As I said, it has now approximately a third less lines code, and the unit test coverage went from 20%, which is basically all the commands and the definition the definition statements of Ruby, to 100%, where really every single line of the provider is tested in depth, and there's a high confidence in there that actually if you change something in there, the unit test will actually then tell you that, oh, your parsing here has broken, or this specific edge case needs fixing. Yeah, you need to install the gem currently both in the Puppet server and the Puppet agent gem environment. Since we're still in development, so there's a 1.0 release on the horizon, but we're still looking for real-world validation of that what we built here actually works for you folks. So currently you still need to install it. We're currently internally speccing out the Puppet 6 platform release for maybe later this year, maybe not. It's still unclear, but that would definitely be a point in time when I would aim for getting the resource API integrated into Puppet proper as a default component, and at that point then you will not have to have any additional installs. No. Obviously, if your gen, if you use specific features of the API, then those need to be available on the agents that are running the code. But once we get into a maturing of this, I would not expect too many more releases. There was another question. Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Thank you.